Okay, we have arrived to Age of Enlightenment, session 3. And today I want to talk about enlightenment as a movement, and what I mean by that is as a social movement. And we'll look at what I think of are some of the traits of a social movement. But the themes that this movement will aspire to, and almost every Enlightenment presentation shares, are ideas of progress and ideas of perfectibility, human perfectibility, that history has an arc and that the arc is upwards. And the emotional quality that characterized these attitudes was one of utter confidence. You hear the thunder by me here, I imagine. But a group that were almost insufferably confident of the way the world was going to move according to their sketchbook. To begin, this is really, despite the fact that the printing press had been around for a couple of centuries, this is really the great age of print, because this is the period in which printing reached deeply into the middle and lower classes. The audience for print was extended remarkably, but that it allowed writers, and that's the theme of my first major bullet, from patronage to a reading public. It allowed writers for the first time in the 18th century to make a living entirely by their writing, that they didn't have to rely on rich or aristocratic patrons, and that they didn't have to rely on university posts, salaried posts. There were not many people in the 18th century who managed to pull this off, but it's the first time we see it happening. We'll see it happen, for instance, with Samuel Johnson. We'll see it happen with David Hume. We'll see it happen with Rousseau, even though he did have patrons. But from early printing and patronage in the 15th to 17th centuries, we find that books were expensive. They were expensive to produce. They were only printed in limited quantities for a very small audience, and often it was a technical audience that could appreciate the works themselves. Popular literature wasn't really invented in our sense. We will see that it's in the 18th century that the novel, as we know it, that the serial novel that was published week to week and month to month begins in the latter part of the 18th century. Authors were supported previously in those earlier centuries, either by salaried positions or by patrons. And I give some examples of it here. So Galileo held minor teaching posts and later received university appointments at Pisa and Padua. Descartes was in the army for a number of years. Then he had a small family inheritance that came through as he left military service. And then as his fame began to spread, he attracted aristocratic patronage and was able to devote himself full time to his intellectual work. John Locke was in the retinue of the Earl of Shaftesbury, himself a philosopher, Anthony Ashley Cooper. And it was Shaftesbury's sponsorship that gave Locke a living of a couple of £100 a year and allowed him, without a university seat, to do his work. Isaac Newton held the Lucasian chair of mathematics and received a stipend. So he was a university-supported scholar. Literacy expanded the popular market significantly in the 18th century. So I have a few statistics here about the book business, the book publishing business. The expansion of the literate public grew exponentially in the 18th century, and it created a marketplace for books, periodicals and newspapers. And you see that chart on the right. I can expand that a bit for our purposes. And you see from 1650 to 1800, there's virtually a geometric expansion. These are color-coded for whether books in English are published in London or outside of London or outside the UK. And outside the UK, you would think they're talking about the colonies, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and to a certain degree they are, but they're also talking about Holland, which was the country with the lowest incursion of censorship in the 18th century. So if you were about to publish something a bit dicey, something that would get the church or the censors in your home country on your case, you would go to Leiden or you would go to Rotterdam to get it published there. And often these publications would come out as 500 volumes, and you distribute them among your friends and an audience that could pay for them, etc. There was upwards of 300,000 book titles printed in the 18th century in English. In Britain, in 1709, they passed the Copyright Act. So indeed, if you did manage to get something into print, the royalties and the proceeds from printing were something that you could control yourself. People just couldn't decide, oh, this is interesting, I will just print my own copy. Much the way software developed copyright acts in the 20th century. The novel, a popular form, was invented in the 18th century. The first one actually being Robinson Crusoe, the Defoe novel, which I believe is published around 1720, 1722, somewhere in that period. By 1750, many authors were able to live entirely from book sales. David Hume, the philosopher, who we'll be talking about a lot as we go forward in this series, actually made his money by publishing a series of histories of the Stuart kings of the 17th century. And they were so well received that he was able to live off the profits of those. He did later on get a job as a librarian at the University of Edinburgh. Was it Edinburgh or Glasgow? I believe it was at Edinburgh. But that was entirely through the manipulation of his friend Adam Smith, and it wasn't done for money. It was done so he could have access to an extensive university library. He had enough money on his own. And then there's this famous quote of Sam Johnson's, "No man but a blockhead ever wrote except for money." This established not just an audience for an Enlightenment class of intellectuals, but it established what I've called here the community of taste. All of a sudden, what we had was a social class of shared values that remember, the criterion for calling something a social class is that it has to be self-conscious. They have to think of themselves as belonging to a group of individuals that have like-minded ideas. They have a shared ethos. And this shared ethos brings into conversation questions like, what is everyone reading? What's everyone thinking? What's in good taste? Much the way we might ask each other, what are you watching on Netflix these days? In a 21st century version of the question. This is not something that ever would have been a conversational trope before. Suddenly there is this group of people And they're not all intellectuals. They're just people who are an audience that consumes the literature of the age. And it's gotten much larger, and it feels very smug and superior about itself. What's good? Oh, we're all reading this these days. We're all picking up Rousseau's Nouvelle Heloise. We're all reading Oliver Goldsmith. We're all going to the plays of Addison and Steele, whatever it happens to be. We're all reading the heroic couplets of Alexander Pope. There is a world of taste. And we have an explosion, besides the books, of newspapers, of magazines, and journals. And when it takes off in the 18th century, it winds up, of course, expanding subcategories of taste. You wind up creating audiences within the larger audience. And so I've got two examples here. Let me expand this. In 1733, the Gentleman's Magazine, which, by the way, you see in my note there, exists into the 20th century. It begins in the early 18th, and is still being published as late as the 1920s, I believe. And you see what it's a little bit of everything. It's your classic, it's the Atlantic, if you will. We have some proceedings on the debates in Parliament. We have essays, controversial essays, humorous, satirical, religious, moral, political, a little bit of everything, op-ed pieces. We have select pieces of poetry, if that's to your liking. We have a succinct account of the most remarkable transactions, foreign and domestic. What's going on in politics? What are people doing over there? We have a list of births, marriages, deaths, promotions, bankrupts. This is 10 years after the South Sea Company went belly up, by the way. We have some economic news, prices of goods and stocks, incidentally, and bills of mortality. Who's been dying of plague lately? A register of books. What's just been published? What might you be interested in? And then on the right, from a much later 1809 period, I tried to get, this existed in the 1770s, but I couldn't get a visual of the front page from the 1770s. An entertaining companion. This is cosmopolitan for the ladies of leisure of the late 18th century, solely to their use and amusement. The fair sex, it's a little blurry here, but we see romantic stories, Antonio and Isabella, love and madness. We have anecdotes. We have the tears of Emma, letters from Mrs. Carter to Miss whoever. I don't even know who they were, but we can read about their letters. So here we have Cosmo from 250 years ago, or at least 250 years ago. And this would have been expanded to by factors of 100. There would have been working men's magazines aimed at what the English would have called mechanics, people who were skilled laborers and their interests, and pieces of advice on how you do this and how you get that and where to shop and the like. Now, the question of literacy, which comes up and should come up at this point in time, the American colonies had by far the highest literacy of the 18th century, 90% for males, 45% for females. And by the way, the ratio of double the literacy rate for men to women is pretty uniformly the case, no matter where the statistic is from, whether it's from the colonies or one of the European countries. In Europe, literacy was highest in the Netherlands, the great book publishing center. The chart on the right represents estimates of male literacy, with the female percentages roughly half of that. So if I pull this down, you can see the Netherlands at the top, in the UK, somewhere between 50 and 60%. And you'll notice the preponderance, the domination of this chart by Northern Europe and Teutonic language Europe. France, as an advanced country, is at 29%, Italy at 23%. But the further you move either to Eastern Europe or Southern Europe, the percentage drops. And this is largely an argument that points to the fact that Protestant countries, because of their emphasis on reading and interpreting scripture, built through their religious organizations, higher access to literacy. Since you have removed in most of sectarian Protestantism, you've removed a priest from the interpretive function of explaining scripture to people. What you wind up with is relying on people to face the truth on their own. It becomes the private access to scripture that the Protestant churches sponsor. And so Northern Europe, England, Scotland, Netherlands, Sweden, Germany would have higher percentages. It's an age where, since books are still pretty expensive, libraries get invented. And the availability and access that most people had to reading material other than broadsides could be expanded by having what were called either, these terms are used slightly differently, but subscription libraries and circulating libraries. Subscription libraries, people, it was like a country club. People bought part of the franchise. They contributed. They became one of the sponsors. And then the monies gathered through the club that supported the library would, both in terms of annual fees and, or a subscription, and a kind of buy-in that you would get, like buying a golf membership at a country club. There's the initial buy-in and then the supporting fees. And the supporting fees, of course, would keep expanding the books held by the library, and everybody could then go in and take them out on loan and use them. The Library Company of Philadelphia, for instance, just such a library, was founded by Ben Franklin and his so-called junto club, a word that comes from the Spanish junta, to lessen the individual expense of accumulating a substantial collection, which in the colonies, of course, is imported. So books were expensive enough as just to get them published, but to bring them across on ships just increased the cost. Circulating libraries were basically the same thing, but they were purely fee-based, less the country club, and were aimed at people of lesser means, and would introduce popular literature. So you might go to a circulating library to get the latest novel by Mary Wollstonecraft or someone, but one would think that the Library of Philadelphia, the picture of the library on Fifth Avenue here in Philadelphia in 1800, that the selection of books would be a little more highfalutin than that, a little more Tony than the dime novels of the age. This social dimension of the Enlightenment is seen most clearly in the venues in which people get together for discussion, for argument, for general sociability, but with a sense of a purpose and values and discourse that would take place in that setting. One of them is, this is the age of the great London coffee houses, which spring up everywhere. And we have a woodcut of everybody going down there and arguing like crazy. Not pubs, not so-called gin mills of the age, but coffee, which was all the rage, beginning a little bit earlier, but taking off in the 18th century. Every social class had an establishment for reading the latest news. The coffee house would purchase a number of broadsheets and bring them in. You remember, like in places like Germany, where the Konditoreis, the little coffee house that would serve pastries, would often have all the local newspapers stacked in racks on the wall. And people would come in and they could discuss, and they'd read their paper, and they'd have a cup of coffee and a slice of cake, kind of thing. Much the same way. And in his literary journal, the famous journal, The Tatler, Richard Steele, a satirist, essentially, describes the folks in these coffee houses, and with immense tongue in cheek, he says, with all these people have all the self-importance. They're deposing princes. They're settling the bounds of kingdoms and balancing the power of Europe with great justice and impartiality. It's like the old joke of the wife who's telling her friend that her husband has a foreign policy as he engages the news on TV. Anyhow, James Boswell, the biographer of Dr. Johnson, the famous biographer of the famous Dr. Johnson, said that Johnson's routine when he was a young man and did not have much money, by spending 3 pence in a coffee house, he might be for some hours every day in very good company, and he could listen to good conversation, and it didn't cost him a whole lot. So these were public venues where you met people who may have been strangers. And this is the whole idea behind the social movement and the social class that supports it. They may have been strangers, but you knew that there was a sensibility that was going to come to the table that wanted to argue politics, or wanted to argue the stock market, or wanted to argue whatever. So there was this shared sensibility. You knew who you were going to find there, even if you didn't know the particular people that you were going to find there. Then, of course, there was the dinner party, which we find in London, we find in Philadelphia, we find in Boston. In Paris, it's going to take a slightly different form, and I'm going to be talking about that in a few minutes. But at coffee houses, taverns, and dinner parties, circles of the cosmopolitan intelligentsia would gather for the exchange of ideas, gossip, and general sociability. Now we're talking about people who did know one another, circles of friends. So we have an intimate familiarity of the circle around Dr. Johnson because of Boswell's worshipful biography. And here we have this print on the lower right, and these are all historically identifiable people in the London of 1750. The engraving depicts Johnson, that's the chunky guy on the left over here, and he's talking to Edmund Burke, the political theorist, Boswell himself, Joshua Reynolds, the painter, David Garrick, the actor and theatrical producer, the impresario, if you will, Pasquale Paoli, the Corsican patriot who was making the rounds, and he was the toast of London for his sense of political liberty and his revolutionary spirit, and he was in London raising money several times, and was received at dinners and was much the toast of the town. Charles Burney, the composer, Thomas Wharton, the literature professor, and Oliver Goldsmith, the novelist, all hail fellows well met, and Johnson loved nothing more than great conversation. And so people would come, they would perhaps have dinner, perhaps there were just some nibbles put out and drinks to be had, ale all around, and the topics would rotate through whomever had the floor at the time. It must have been a fascinating table to sit around. And the junto that I mentioned earlier, Ben Franklin's club, had a kind of a different take. But this is, and I mention this because I want to point out how something about how the Enlightenment expresses itself in the English-speaking colonies of North America. The junto, which was also called the Leather Apron Club, because tradespeople and artisans, printers, for instance, glaziers, and anybody sort of on the higher end of the working class would have worn a leather apron. And Franklin, himself a printer, not just a writer, but himself a printer, who's born very early in the century, as you say, 1706, sponsors this club for his buddies, 12 original members, all artisans and tradesmen, and they have discussions of politics and morals and science and business. But we will see that it's not just a club for entertainment. And this quote comes from the remarkable, if you've never read it, by the way, autobiography, it's very short, of Benjamin Franklin. And he talks about how he got to be the man he was, his path to self-improvement. And he gets attacked in the early 20th century. The book gets attacked by D.H. Lawrence, who said, oh, if the human soul were only this tiny little bourgeois garden to be tended by somebody, some self-help specialist like Benjamin Franklin. But there's D.H. Lawrence, the author of Lady Chatterley, who's saying, no, the soul is deep and dark, and he takes great issue with this this kind of manual for how you straighten yourself up and become an Eagle Scout, which is the way he was trying to characterize Franklin. Despite this, Franklin's autobiography is remarkable. And this is from that, and he says, I should have mentioned before that in the autumn of the preceding year, 1727, I had formed most of my ingenious acquaintance, my brighter colleagues, my ingenious acquaintance, into a club of mutual improvement. You see, I've emphasized the phrase mutual improvement, which we called the junto. We met on Friday evenings. The rules that I drew up required that every member in his turn should produce one or more queries on any point of morals, politics, or natural philosophy, that's what we would call science or technology, to be discussed by the company. And once in 3 months, produce and read an essay of his own writing on any subject he pleased. Our debates were to be under the direction of a president, we have structure, and to be conducted in the sincere spirit of inquiry after truth, without fondness for dispute or desire of victory, and to prevent warmth, all expressions of positiveness in opinions or direct contradiction were after some time made contraband. We can't have that, and prohibited under small pecuniary penalties, fines. You get into an argument, you're going to get fined. The president gets to impose the fine. And here they are, a little woodcut of some of the members of the junto. Here's Franklin standing. They've got maps or whatever out on the table. And the point I'm making here is not the peculiarly American emphasis on self-improvement. which is, of course, the dominant motif of his autobiography. The Enlightenment in the colonies, which, and remember, except for Virginia and South Carolina, the northern, and Georgia, the northern colonies were not founded or populated by aristocrats. These were, the Puritan and Quaker and Catholic colonies. These were middle-class folk who transported Bibles in hand. And these people came imbued with the spirit of Protestant self-help and bootstrap bourgeois capitalism. This was a very different sensibility. Certainly it was a very different sensibility than the sort of thing that we would find on particularly the continent, in the Catholic countries, like Paris. And we come to a slide in which I want to talk about the Parisian salon. And these were organized not by Ben Franklin's and not by David Hume's and not down at the local coffee house. These were organized by French aristocratic women. And they brought together the rich and the powerful, as well as the intellectual and artistic classes. It was a who's who of high society in that world that would be invited, and people vied for invitations to these. They were highly desirable, and guests were expected to shine. You were expected to be a star, much like in the later period. If you made it to Gertrude Stein's literary salon, you better be a bright bulb. Literary readings, performances, scintillating conversation gave them public exposure, and the names of the leading salonières, the women who sponsored these, would be known internationally. Their names not only ring to us across history, but they were names that would have been mentioned in the broadsides of London. The penny newspapers would say, oh, there was a big do at Madame Geoffrin's, for instance. And some of their names, the Countess of Boufflers, whose name among the wags in London would get referred to as Madame Blue Flowers, for instance, because she was known to be a sponsor of these great social dues for the luminaries in Paris. Madame Necker, who was the wife of Louis XVI's finance reformer. Had he been listened to, perhaps the revolution could have been averted. Madame Geoffrin, who I make up a point of showing in her salon here, because in this note at the bottom left, she invented the actual form that the Enlightenment salon in Paris took. She moved the dinner from late evening to early afternoon because she wanted people not to be wiped out so that they could stage performances and readings and the like. The entire day was open to talk, and she designated a fixed day of the week for gathering. And so this painting by Lemonnier was a reading by Voltaire of one of his plays, I believe, in the salon in her palace. And there she is, and we can blow her up. And it's a who's who. So the Voltaires of the world, and if they were not the Voltaires, but if they were the young Rousseaus of the world or whomever, they could come and be seen by people who could sponsor them. Oh, I'd like to commission a play written in honor of whatever. Would you do that for me, sir or madam? So Madame Geoffrin, Madame du Deffand, Mademoiselle de l'Espinasse, Madame d'Épinay, Madame de Staël, these were all famous salons competing one with the other, sometimes with specializations. Sometimes one would be known for the writers who would be gathered. Others were known for music that would be presented, and which brings me sort of through a back door to the issue of women in this class of intellectuals in the Enlightenment. So obviously, because of the sense of progress and it decrying the world of the Middle Ages as it saw as backward and subjugating, the subjugation of women was seen by the Enlightenment as a vestige of the Dark Ages. A central tenet of the movement became the intellectual equality of women. Now, the only women who could serve as examples, however, were members of the aristocracy or upper bourgeoisie. On paper, you get many writers, including male writers, arguing for the equality of women. Those who got to practice as equals in the new enterprises were people, of course, of means. And I mentioned a couple along the way here. Émilie du Châtelet, mathematician, physicist, a long-time romantic partner of Voltaire's. The Marquise de Châtelet translated and wrote a commentary on Newton's Principia Mathematica. She made significant contributions to Newtonian mechanics. Her explanation of energy actually moved the ball downfield. And her ideas were heavily represented in Dieterelle's Encyclopedia, which I'm going to talk about in a slide or two. So we have a mathematician and scientist of note. We have Catherine Macaulay, later in the century, a noted so-called Whig or liberal historian and philosopher who defended Republican principles against the monarchism of Hobbes and the so-called Tory conservatism of David Hume and Edmund Burke. And she became a big celebrity for her liberal ideas in America. And a quote from her: "Of all the various models of republics which have been exhibited for the instruction of mankind, it is only the democratical system, rightly balanced," she read her Montesquieu, "which can secure the virtue, liberty, and happiness of society." Her letters on education, written in 1990, were not a full-throated argument for the equality of women, but made the case for the reform of women's education. As she says here, the situation and education of women, Hortensia, is precisely that which must necessarily tend to corrupt and debilitate both the powers of mind and body. From a false notion of beauty and delicacy, their system of nerves is depraved before they come out of their nursery. It's the education of women that creates the shrinking assumption, or women as this shrinking violet, that the 18th century or the previous centuries would have seen women as this weaker sex, this person who is delicate, beautiful but delicate and subject to nerves, etc., and the vapors. Suddenly, here is a woman saying, "Well, if you change the educational system, we can do away with that, can't we?" And of course, the famous Mary Wollstonecraft, who did not live long, unfortunately, the mother of Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, the feminist, novelist, translator, philosopher, travel writer, influenced by Macaulay, well known for her republicanism. She writes the Vindication of the Rights of Men. It was a response to Burke's attack on the French Revolution, which we will talk about in a later session. As a product of the middle classes, she had a very keen sympathy for the Third Estate, the general population of France. Time may show that this obscure throng knew more of the human heart and of legislation than the profligates of rank emasculated by hereditary effeminacy. Those aristocrats emasculated by hereditary privilege. This wonderful portrait. I don't know who painted that. I should look that up. It's a wonderful portrait. Anyhow, and on the equality of women, she writes her masterpiece in 1792, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, landmark in early feminist literature. Wollstonecraft's theory of women's equality is quite nuanced, however. I do not wish them to have power over men, but over themselves. I love man as my fellow, but his scepter, his ruling scepter, real or usurped, extends not to me, unless the reason of an individual demands my homage. And even then, the submission is to reason and not to man. If indeed I recognize somebody as having authority over me, it's because of their qualities as an individual, not inherited from their gender. And this is the famous first printing, I believe, Political and Moral Subjects. She was heavily influenced by Rousseau's Emile, which we will talk about in detail in a future session. And she wrote Thoughts on the Education of Daughters as a practical handbook aimed at the middle classes. So she wrote a book on, because Rousseau's Emile was a book on how you educate a young man. She wrote a handbook, practical handbook on here's how you should bring up a daughter, aiming at middle class people, people from the third estate. Now, in Paris, the celebrities, the major intellectuals of the Enlightenment movement were referred to as philosophes, the philosophers of Paris. It was the center of the continental universe. Intellectuals from every country in Europe came to Paris to engage the newly expanded and cosmopolitan world of letters. And remember, French was as I point out, it's probably someplace on this slide, was the lingua franca of the movement. Everyone knew French if you had pretense to being educated. Now, there were rival intellectual centers, the two most important in Europe being London and Edinburgh in Scotland. And in Edinburgh, there were the thinkers of the so-called and very important Scottish Enlightenment were based. And we will talk about the Scottish Enlightenment. But the Hollywood, the place it wanted to be, ground zero was in the 18th century was Paris. The most famous of the French contingent of the philosophes included Voltaire, François-Marie Arouet, writer, critic, the father figure, the grandpa, the stepfather of the whole movement. Denis Diderot, the philosopher, art critic, and chief editor of the Encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia, which we will talk about in a slide or two. This significant major work in the 18th century. And his co-editor, Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, mathematician, music theorist, and as I said, his co-editor, the most famous and perhaps the most celebrated, maybe the most mystifying and remarkable intellectual in the world in the 18th century is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who we'll spend a lot of time with in a future session. Philosopher, novelist, the enfant terrible of Paris. He was the bad boy. He was constantly insulting people and getting into intellectual contests with them and having falling out, threatening never to speak to them again. He was hard to miss. Claude Helvetius, the psychologist and educational theorist, and someone whose quotations we'll look at a little later in this session, the Marquis de Condorcet, a philosopher and a mathematician. But there were all these other folks in Paris who would come in and out of the salon meetings and dinners, who were not French. So we have one of the great presences through the whole period was the Baron de Holbach, German philosopher and translator. Mary Wollstonecraft, who we just took a peek at, English feminist and novelist. Cesare Beccaria, the Italian jurist and criminologist, whose liberal ideas about how prisons should operate became well known in the 19th century. David Hume, the famous Scottish philosopher and historian, who was much loved because of his bonhomie and sort of high-spirited fellowship that he brought to everyone and everything. He always sounded like quite the mensch, but they always commented about his horribly Scottish accented French in Paris. People said, I always said, I know he's speaking French, but I still need a translator. Benjamin Franklin, the printer and polymath, the man of many parts, and later representative of the breakaway colonies, come to Paris to obtain French support in resisting the enemy British. Baron von Grimm, the German art critic and journalist. Thomas Jefferson, as the statesman and future president, makes his appearance there and goes to several of the salons. And so here we have a painting called The Philosopher's Dinner. And we know that at this table depicted, here is Voltaire, and there's Condorcet and Diderot and D'Alembert, and I don't know who's who of the others, but in a painting that celebrates the whole idea that this is what the best minds of our generation were up to at this point in time. Now, switching to Edinburgh for a moment, because I've referred to what was known as the Scottish Enlightenment, and I called this the Learned Gentlemen of Edinburgh. 18th century Scotland became a center for philosophical and particularly social science. All sorts of innovations in particularly anthropology, history, economics, which we will look into next session. It's actually the central topic of the next session. But this Renaissance in Edinburgh is decidedly middle class in character. While there would have been aristocratic attendance at dinners in London, because London was a cosmopolitan center of 600,000 people, that's not the same size as, or 700,000 people, I believe. Paris was about 600,000 people at the time. And the aristocrats would have dominated the attendees in Paris. But in little backwater Edinburgh, a little provincial town of 60,000 people, there's no such thing as an aristocratic presence. And the intellectuals are people from the professions. They are doctors. They are lawyers. They are clergy of the Presbyterian Church from the liberal branch. The Presbyterian Church in Scotland by the 18th century had two major groups, the so-called, the conservative fundamentalist group called by the others, the High Flyers, as they were known, and a liberal element called the Moderates, who were interested very much in the social aspects of ethics and the Gospels, more so than the fire zone elements of the high flyers. So from these professional classes, which all of which allowed intellectual pursuits, because these were people who had, given the middle class world that they were from, substantial salaried support by their careers. And so you had this kind of professional class, not the leather apron crowd of Philadelphia, but a kind of what we think of as the professions: university professors, doctors, lawyers, churchmen. And Edinburgh became known as the Athens of the North. These intellectuals, since this town was only 60,000 people, everybody on the list below, everyone knew everyone else. Basically, in small groups, they could all wind up showing up at each other's dinners. We have heavy correspondences of letters between some of these folks and others of these folks. We have bosom buddy friendships. David Hume and Adam Smith, for instance, were lifelong best friends, even though Hume is a good 10 to 15 years, I believe, older than Smith. They have no grand salons. They have no patrons. This community had small dinner parties at private apartments. They met in reading societies and men's clubs. And much of the anecdotes that we have of their dinners, from letters, from diaries, from memoirs, are often with humorous but kindly reflections on others of their buddies. One of the churchmen who often hosted dinners was named Jardine, James Jardine, and he had Hume and a few other friends over to dinner. And in Edinburgh, in those Georgian houses, those row houses that you find in the so-called New Town of Edinburgh, the most desirable place to live would be on what we would call the second story, above the muck of the ground floor. They would have called it the first floor. But you didn't want to be at ground level because that's where all the filth got dumped. So you try to rise above the odors, but you didn't want to be so high as to have to climb too many stairs. But so Jardine had his apartments up a flight. And when it was time to go home, he offered Hume, he says, can I light your way down the stairs, and then we'll find a caddy for you. Caddies in Edinburgh were people who showed you, they accompanied you home so that they would have a lamp with them, and they were also protection from, late night muggers and things like that. And he said, can I light your way, Davy, can I light your way down the stairs? And he says, no, I'll make it on my own. And Hume, who was this 350-pound great man, of course, trips on the upper stairs, and he rolls to the bottom of the stairs, and Jardine goes running down after him, and he asks him if he's in one piece, and Hume says, I've survived. And then Jardine, now that he knows Hume's okay, says, as I've often told you, he being the Presbyterian minister, and he's talking to the atheistic Hume, and he says, as I've often told you, natural light is not sufficient. And that's what passes for a joke in Presbyterian Edinburgh in the mid to late 18th century. But we have Hume, the philosopher and historian. We have Smith, the philosopher and economist. William Robertson, the anthropologist and historian. Joseph Black, the famous physicist and chemist. Francis Hutcheson, a noteworthy philosopher who we'll mention. Adam Ferguson, who almost single-handedly invents modern sociology. Thomas Reid, the common sense philosopher. Douglas Stewart, the mathematician. Alan Ramsey, the wonderful portrait painter. Robert Burns, the poet, James Watt, the engineer and inventor of the most efficient of the 18th century steam engines. And here we have Black visiting Watt in his workshop. It's a small town. They all know one another. They all get together all the time. Now, some of these Enlightenment assumptions that were shared by this class. And first of all, the word Enlightenment, which they used themselves. The breakthroughs in math, science, technology engendered a confidence in intellectual circles that the future was going to be one of ever-expanding progress. The arc of history is upwards. The backwardness and mumbo-jumbo of the Middle Ages had been replaced by light and clarity, and so it was about light. This was the age of enlightenment, the siècle de lumière. It's der Aufklärung. It's the brightening. Light has been cast in the darkness. And the last in the century and most outspoken voice for progress and light is the Marquis de Condorcet. No one echoed their sense of optimism quite the way he did. He was a patron of the really new free market economy and constitutional government and equal rights for everyone and universal education, all the right ideas. The following excerpts are from his sketch for a historical picture of the progress of the human mind, which he writes in 1795. The impact of universal education. We shall point out how more universal education in each country, by giving more people the elementary knowledge that can inspire them with a taste for more advanced study and give them the capacity for making progress in it, can add to such hopes. At present, in the most enlightened countries, hardly a 50th part of those men to whom nature has given talent receive the education necessary to make use of their talents. And that, therefore, the number of men destined to push back the frontiers of the sciences by their discoveries will grow in the same proportion. He says on the progress of industry and agriculture, instruments, machines, looms will increasingly supplement the strength and skill of men, will augment at the same time the perfection and the precision of manufacturers by lessening both the time and the labor needed to produce them. He probably had read his Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations by this point. Then a smaller and smaller area of land will be able to produce commodities of greater use or value. Literally, there will be an increase in human productivity. Not just an increase, but an increase towards perfection. He hypothesizes that the success of the human project will produce a population expansion, and think here of Thomas Malthus, the man who warned about expanding population, and we will address that in time, that might suggest a hard limit to growth. In other words, he understands that this progression will increase population. Whoop, would you mute yourselves, please? There, let me. Just make sure. Okay. So he knows that population will expand. And he knows that that might lead to a problem. And this is what he says. It's interesting that in 1795, someone would be making this argument. But supposing a limit were reached, nothing terrible would happen regarding either the happiness or the indefinite perfectibility of mankind. We must also suppose that before that time, the progress of reason will have gone hand in hand with progress in the arts and sciences. Men will know then that if they have obligations to beings who do not yet exist, to our children and grandchildren, These obligations do not consist in giving life, but in giving happiness. Their object is the general welfare of the human species, of the society in which people live, of the family to which they belong, and not the puerile idea of filling the earth with useless and unhappy beings. The possible quantity of the means of subsistence could therefore have a limit, and consequently, so could the attainable level of population without resulting in the destruction of part of the living. So he's suggesting here things like planning on impeding population growth so that the level of happiness can be maintained. So it's not just a matter of expanding the ability to feed more people, but that perhaps a hard limit would get reached, and you have to think about the future. On the equality of women, he says, among the progress of the human mind that is most important for human happiness, we must count the entire destruction of the prejudices that have established inequality between the sexes, fatal even to the sex it favors. This inequality has no other source but the abuse of power, and men have tried in vain to excuse it by sophisms. That's pretty aggressive. Life expectancy. We feel that the progress of preventive medicine as a preservative, made more effective by the progress of reason and social order, will eventually banish communicable or contagious illnesses and those diseases in general that originate in climate, food, and the nature of work. Would it be absurd now to suppose that a time will come when death would result only from extraordinary accidents or the more and more gradual wearing out of vitality? Can we actually get rid of diseases to the point that you just die of old age? The machine wears out. Interesting. Now last week in the discussion at the end of the class, I believe it was Debbie Geltman who raised the question of how did these ideas, to what degree did they filter down? It's ideas of this order that became commonplace by the early 19th century, so that the social reform movements that you see taking place in England and in Prussia, expansions of access to education, mechanics institutes, all this kind of thing, you get to see social programs being militated for from below, but being thought of as a good idea from above, from the ruling classes. You find implementation of a lot of Enlightenment programmatic theory. So there was an impact. Doesn't take place overnight, but the seeds are planted. Now, this encyclopedia that we have been talking about, nothing speaks to Enlightenment confidence and self-assurance as much as it was called, the Systematic Dictionary of the Sciences, Arts, and Crafts, published over a 20-year, 2-decade period with lots of revisions, and it was the first of the great encyclopedias. Britannica gets invented in about 1811, I believe it's the first Britannica. But imagine the enterprises conceived by Dieterelle and d'Alembert. The enterprise is one collaborative compendium that contains the sum of all the latest knowledge in the world. What speaks to confidence and optimism greater than this? Let's put it all down. We understand, it will not be exhausted. We understand that it's only a line in the sand, and no sooner does it get written down than we need to start rewriting it and expanding it. We understand that it's always perpetually out of date, but let us make the effort. So in the preliminary discourse to the Encyclopedia of Dieterelle, which was written by D'Alembert, it's a preface and encapsulates the Enlightenment vision that humans possess the capability to improve the conditions of their lives through the development and application of reason. And it addresses the idea that there should be a democratization of knowledge. Part of the purpose, Diderot's purpose in conceiving of the Encyclopedia, and by the way, encyclopedia is a word made up of two Greek words, enkyklaios, paideia. And enkyklaios is a circle, and paideia is learning or education. It is the circle, as I've titled the slide, it is the circle of learning. And universities, as they move forward into the 19th century, the idea of a well-rounded curriculum that everybody should know something of all these topics, pick up the theme of the encyclopedia. So Diderot's purpose was to create access to education beyond the interference of state censors or the strong stranglehold on schools that was held in France by the Jesuits at the time. Articles on philosophy and theology, of course, as you would expect coming from Enlightenment thinkers, were predictably unsympathetic to Christian doctrine, superstition in the medieval sense. And so to avoid suppression by the censors, writers had to become very ironic, and their criticism had to be very oblique. You couldn't do it head on. I got a sample of this from Voltaire in a later slide. Articles on history, economics, and politics featured the libertarian anti-monarchical assumptions of the Enlightenment that later were echoed during the French Revolution. Articles on science and technology really were cutting edge and fit Diderot's requirements that entries be useful to common people. So he actually got experts on, if there was going to be an article on the printing press, he got somebody from the printing industry to write the article. Now, it was, interestingly enough, it was based, the encyclopedia itself was based on, and this is very much a nod to Descartes and Locke from the previous century. It's not on subject areas as dictated by nature somehow, but they're subject areas dictated by the way the mind works. So for instance, in this box on the right, there's a huge chart, which I couldn't get enough of it onto a slide so that it would be clearly read, but there's this huge, elaborate hierarchical chart titled The Figurative System of Human Knowledge, which was a tree of mental functions. And this analysis of the way the mind works at the highest level are memory, reason, and imagination. And the subject areas of the encyclopedia mirror those. So history is the subject area pointed back at memory. Science and philosophy point back at reason. Fine art points back at imagination. And then he subcategorizes this into like hundreds and hundreds of branches as you work down the tray. So Descartes and Locke, in their sense that philosophy and reality are first and best engaged through an analysis of mind and perception, is here honored by their grandchildren, Diderot and D'Alembert. Diderot's article on the encyclopedia itself, he says, indeed, the purpose of an encyclopedia is to collect knowledge disseminated around the globe, to set forth its general system to the men with whom we live, and transmit it to those who will come after us, so that the work of preceding centuries will not become useless to the centuries to come. Let's not have another dark age, huh? And so that our offspring, becoming better instructed, will at the same time become more virtuous and happier, and that we should not die without having rendered a service to the human race. When one considers the immense material for an encyclopedia, the only thing one perceives distinctly is that it cannot be the work of a single man. And indeed, there are 38,000 entries in this encyclopedia written over 20 years. The progress of reason, the encyclopedia itself will become outdated, he argues, but that which will lend the opus an outdated feel and cover it with scorn is above all the revolution that will take place in men's minds and in the national character. We will change a national character by changing the individuals of the nation. Now that philosophy is rapidly advancing, that it submits all the objects within its jurisdictions to its power, now that its tone is the prevailing one, and we are beginning to shake off the yoke of authority and example to hold to the laws of reason, there exists hardly a single elementary and dogmatic work with which we can be wholly satisfied. Such is the effect of the progress of reason. Reason means to move past what the consensus version is now. It's the whole paradigm of science, that science is a series of paradigms. We have explanations which as we pursue them will be replaced by ever better and reorganized paradigms. Now, the contributors to the encyclopedia were just everybody. The encyclopedia was the product of the movement. The list of voluntary contributors, and people were not getting paid for this, was a who's who of intellectual luminaries, most of whom wrote multiple articles in their areas of expertise. Montesquieu, Rousseau, D'Holbach, Voltaire, all contributed. The one aristocrat, the Chevalier Louis de Jaucourt, authored 18,000 articles on, I don't know what else this guy did, on physiology, chemistry, botany, pathology, and political history. Roughly 25% of the entire encyclopedia was written by this guy. Rousseau wrote something like 20 articles on music, of all things. Here's a sample essay, and I pulled this out. It's one of Voltaire's. I pull it out because you get the sense of how smug, in one sense, Enlightenment figures were about what they thought their contribution to history was, but also how careful they had to be when addressing something that would get on the wrong side of the censors or the Jesuits or the monarchy. And this is part of his essay on the subject history. History is the narrative of facts presented as true, in contrast to the fable, which is the recitation of facts presented as false. There is very arch and very tongue-in-cheek. There is the history of opinions, which is hardly other than the collection of human errors, the history of the arts, perhaps the most useful of all when it is joined to the knowledge of inventions and the progress of the arts, and which is the description of their mechanism. Natural history, an appropriately termed history, and which is an essential part of physics. The history of events is divided into the sacred and the profane. Sacred history, now he's going to be on thin ice, right? Sacred history is the series of divine and miraculous operations by which it pleased God in the past to conduct the Jewish nation and to exercise our faith today. I will not touch upon this respectable matter, as he says, almost with a laugh. The basic foundations of all history are the stories recounted by fathers to their children and subsequently transmitted from one generation to the next. They are merely probable in their origins and lose a degree of probability with each succeeding generation. Over time, the fable grows and the truth is lost. Hence, the origins of all peoples are absurd. All certainty, which is not mathematically demonstrable, is only a distant probability. There is no other historical certainty, very much his own character. This liberal tide of sentiment even extends in France into the Ancien Regime, into the nobility that represents the old world. So before the revolution, the new ideas and literary forms completely penetrated the French aristocracy, who by and large provided the patronage and provided an elite audience for these new fashions. Now, there were censors, but ironically, a lot of Enlightenment publication in France and the writers were not at odds with the censors. As the critical experts, several philosophers, including Dieterelle and D'Alembert themselves, were occasionally employed as censors. The most famous, the man who controlled censorship in Paris in the latter part of the century, was this remarkable figure, Malesherbes, Chrétien Guillaume de Lamoignon de Malesherbes. He's a monarchist. He later serves and sacrifices his life to it. Because, I mean, he's really this incredibly moralist figure. He serves as the counsel for the defense of Louis XVI at his trial. He sees the way the crowd's going and he still stands up. Throughout his career, Malesherbes proposed fiscal and bureaucratic reforms. He promoted efficiency in government. He was on good terms with philosophers, and he was notably a close friend of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. His regard for the New Thought was quite liberal, while he opposed and suppressed books that directly attacked the government and church authority. He frequently overruled censorship of philosophical or literary works that were deemed dangerous by other censors. And his argument was essentially this, that if you institute a regime of extreme censorship, it would scare off moderate thinkers, people who are in the middle, people that we think of are sort of the middle of the political spectrum. They will fear being taken for radicals and what this might do to their careers and reputations. Modest and reasonable authors who would be the most useful to the public will be scared off. The only ones who will still risk speaking out on sensitive subjects in a world of extreme censorship are going to be radicals and firebrands who would publish radical and firebrand ideas. And he says, and we would lose the middle ground. We would lose the middle road. And a line from Voltaire about Malesherbes, Monsieur de Malesherbes tirelessly served the human spirit by giving to the press more liberty than it has ever had. So you right into the maw of what you think of as the reactionary institutions. Enlightenment ideas had penetrated significantly. We spoke last week about constitutionalism, and this is the age of three very distinct constitutions. Three countries attempted to correct their traditional but unsatisfactory political order by creating and adopting new constitutions: the American colonies, France, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The climate of reason, the Enlightenment ideas of republicanism, democracy, separation of powers, and social contract guided the debates over optimal rearrangements. These ideas permeated the sensibility of the entire educated class. Political intellectuals weighed in on particular cases. Rousseau wrote a famous essay on considerations on the government of Poland. And so the climate of reason contributed to this group of ideas that informed all these political movements. But it was also the confidence that you could get to something that was superior, if not perfect, as Condorcet would have had it. The class assumption was that the old political institutions were relics relics of a dark age, mired in serendipity and local superstition. This was a new age where rationality and science could lead to equitable, progressive results. What worked in physics, what worked in industry, what worked in medicine, could work in politics. Right order was seen confidently as the product of the rational mind. And the self-evidence of reason was something that all these constitutions claimed. In the enlightened mind, the correct course was obvious. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government, says the Declaration of Independence. And in our last slide, in art, we have, of course, each of these famous assemblies of people come together to rewrite their world. If you will, this is the opening of the General Assembly at Versailles, May 5th, 1789, with the three estates. And we have, sorry about that. And we have the Senate chamber in Warsaw on May 3rd, 1791, where they adopt a new constitution. And of course, we have this famous picture from signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776 in Philadelphia. And I blow up on the right that inset. These were, again, to reinforce the fact that the founding fathers of the American Constitution were Enlightenment figures. So here we have Adams, Jefferson, and Franklin, among others. They knew their political theory. They'd read their Montesquieu. They knew their Polybius and Cicero. The Latin and Greek sections of Jefferson's library, which you can now see in a room in the Library of Congress, by the way, just a remarkable collection. I mean, he was a real intellectual in this crowd. But they also, Adams, Jefferson, and Franklin had spent their time in Parisian salons. And they were imbued with these ideas, and to think of these figures as anything other than products of the Enlightenment is to do them a disservice. And with that, I will end this and stop the share. And if I can unpin myself. And there we are for today. Okay, everyone. Any comments or questions or observations or?
Hi, Lou.
Harold.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. I just want to recommend a book called The Club. Oh, wait.
The Club?
Yeah.
What is it?
Here it is. It's a book about Johnson Boswell and that group that formed their own club to talk about this and that. And it's by Leo Damrush. It's quite a very good read. And it describes that their discussions and their lives very entertainingly. So I recommend it to you all.
Thanks for that. That sounds terrific.
You're welcome.
I just kept thinking, oh my gosh, how far we've fallen. The age of enlightenment. What is this age? You know, it's so depressing. So depressing.
Well, you know, interestingly enough, when we on the last, not next week it will be treating a lot of things that happened during the Scottish Enlightenment. But the last two classes, one really on the birth of the Romantic movement and its objections to the Enlightenment view of the world, and the last one, which will be on formal political reactionary responses to Enlightenment theory and what that was based on, we'll see some of the elements that encourage the kind of tribal nationalism that we now see afoot, as Sherlock Holmes would have said.
Right. That's what I was thinking, like with all these wonderful ideas and these high-minded theories and everything, they just don't seem to take in human nature into account, so.
And that'll be one of the objections. There you go. You're ahead of your time.
How much did the philosophes in France and the philosophers, if we will, in England, feel that they drew something from the classical philosophers that you discussed last week?
How much were they aware of that?
Yes, and how?
I think a lot, actually, Mary.
Yeah.
It was like the foundation of their education. Remember when their take on 17th century science was that it was a resumption of the path that the Greek and Roman worlds were on. That may not be true, but it was their assumption that they were picking up.
So it was at least a realization of what had preceded.
Yes, exactly. And they always wanted to argue that history was moving along quite nicely, thank you. And then there was the Dark Ages, and really a kind of superstitious form of religiosity got in the way, and it took us down a dark road, but we've made it back to the main line now, and we will continue to progress into the future. So they wanted to think.
So thank God they took the right road.
Yeah. Anyhow, that's it for this
Thank you, Lou. Thank you.
I timed it well this week, okay?
Yes.
And we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Lou. See you.
Thank you.
Take care, troops.